All through the 1930s, the United States Navy conducted war games, exercises at sea known as fleet problems, under simulated wartime conditions. It was a diligent planning, conduct, and analysis of these exercises that prepared our Navy to meet and defeat the Japanese fleet at the Battle of Midway. For the invasion of Midway Atoll, the Japanese had spent months setting up an elaborate plan of operations involving 200 ships. They wargamed the plan aboard Admiral Yamamoto's flagship, the Yamato. On the other hand, Admirals King and Nimitz had only 3 frantic weeks to come up with a plan to ambush the Japanese carriers as they attacked Midway, mobilize our Navy's forces, and mount our operation. This rapid deployment of our fleet was made possible only by the experience in carrier warfare gained by our hardcore professional officers, crews, and air groups during the realistic fleet problems of the 1930s. Let's take a look at the circumstances surrounding the fleet problems and the conditions under which they were conducted. The Great Depression, budget cuts, the rise of fascism in Germany, Italy, and Japan, and the growth of pacifism and isolationism in the United States. As the euphoria faded over the 1918 defeat of the Kaiser in World War I, it was replaced in the 1920s by recognition of the horrors of war. Wars had plagued mankind for thousands of years, but now the ancient balladeer singing songs that glorified heroic warriors was replaced by newspapers, magazines, and films graphically depicting the horrors of the wounded and dying in the slime of Europe's trenches. Anti-war films like Wings and All Quiet on the Western Front became box office hits. The glories of the war to end all wars was replaced by the pacifism of the 1930s, nurtured by the Great Depression, isolationist tendencies that were formed to resist any future involvement in foreign wars. As America disarmed, Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and imperialistic Japan continued to rearm, disregarding disarmament treaties signed by well-intentioned democratic political leaders, responding to public demand. All 3 dictators built powerful armies and navies, often in secret. Germany and Japan became more confident of their military might in the late 1930s, and war clouds hung over Europe and China. An isolationist group, known as the American First Committee, became a powerful political influence in the United States. Founded by students at Yale University, it grew to 800,000 members by 1939. Leading spokesmen were Colonel McCormick, publisher of the Chicago Tribune, and Charles Lindbergh. In 1941, shortly before the outbreak of war, Congress extended the Selective Service Act by the narrow margin of 1 vote. Despite the efforts of President Roosevelt to bolster the defensive capabilities of our armed forces, the United States was plunged into World War II woefully unprepared at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack. Britain and France bought us the time we needed to build a decisive army and navy. There were probably less than 37,000 regular naval officers at the start of the war. Most were Annapolis-trained career officers. In addition to this key contingent, the Navy had the warrant officers, chiefs, and ratings, who re-enlisted year after year during the hard times of the 30s. These experienced men were available when needed to provide a manpower framework to enable the huge wartime expansions of the 40s as they were distributed among the new ships to mold the raw recruits. This hard core of dedicated officers and men had persevered in carrying out the Navy's annual fleet problems. The exercises were well planned and intense, demanding all the devotion and talents of the men who participated under conditions that simulated wartime and called for extended tours of sea duty. As you look back on these fleet problems, you will find it mystifying that we were so unprepared for the December 7th attack on Pearl Harbor, and that the Battle of Midway was so badly mismanaged. It is interesting to trace the progress of naval aviation, from the first introduction of a carrier, the Langley, in the 1926 Fleet Program as an auxiliary, to Fleet Problem 21 in 1940, when the carrier task forces acted as a long-distance striking force independent of the main battleship forces. As aircraft increased in speed, range, and bomb loadings, the fleet problems reflected the value of their new capabilities. Most significant was the refinement of dive bombing tactics. It was soon learned that the steeper the dive, the more accurate was the bomb drop. New planes and new carriers were built to take advantage of the new and more powerful aircraft. First the Saratoga and Lexington in 1927, then the Ranger in 1934, Yorktown 1937, Enterprise 1938, and Wasp 1940. It was not until 1929 that a major aviation breakthrough occurred. Rear Admiral Joseph Reeves, commander of the aircraft squadrons of a simulated enemy force, dispatched the carrier Saratoga and its escorts away from the main battleship fleet and made a daring high-speed run in a mock attack on the Panama Canal. This exploit received extensive press coverage. Writing many years later, Commander Wilson, who had been one of Reeves' staff in 1929, would rightly state that the Saratoga exploits during Fleet Problem 9 marked the first step in the development of the carrier task forces, which were so effective in the Pacific. This operation convinced naval aviators and some surface warriors, such as Admiral Pratt, that task forces built around carriers would be of importance in the future of naval warfare. The first long-distance battle, pitting aircraft carrier versus aircraft carrier, was simulated in 1930. I quote, "Then at 0810, the 3 Lexington Scout bombers made a dive bombing attack on the Saratoga, damaging the forward edge of a flight deck. At 0829, just 14 minutes after the Scout bomber strike, the first waves of Lexington dive bombers, 45 aircraft in all, began a series of attacks that rendered Saratoga's flight deck useless, wrecked half our aircraft, and destroyed a number of anti-aircraft guns. Then 4 minutes later, at 0333, 15 Lexington fighter bombers made a pass at Saratoga and then hit Langley. Within 2 minutes, a dozen more Lexington fighter bombers hit Langley. The umpires ruled that both carriers had been destroyed, as well as all their aircraft. In 20 minutes, both blue carriers had been put out of action, in an incident eerily resembling the fate of 3 Japanese carriers at Midway in 1942. Virtually all observers commented on the importance in carrier warfare of getting in the first blow. This comment is repeated in the analysis of the 1931 exercise. Of even greater importance was that the lesson of Fleet Problem 10 as to the importance of getting in the first blow against enemy carriers was clearly reaffirmed in Fleet Problem 11. 1932 was an interesting year following the invasion of China by Japan. The exercise's scenario proposed that Hawaii had been taken over by an enemy and the United States Navy was dispatched to take it back. Captain John Towers, Chief of Staff, planned to use the carriers Lexington and Saratoga to launch a sneak attack on the Army in Hawaii. On Saturday, February 5th, the two carriers left the main battle fleet, making high-speed runs into a launch position 100 miles north of Oahu during the night. At dawn Sunday morning, a surprised army woke to the roar of fleets of aircraft attacking their installations. Captain Towers had timed the attack perfectly. The Army protested to the umpires that it was unfair for Towers to make his attack on a Sunday morning. The fact that Japan nearly duplicated this attack on Pearl on Sunday morning, December 7, 1941, was no accident. Early in the 1950s, Admiral Towers dined in Tokyo with a Japanese vice admiral who had participated in planning. He told me that they had simply taken a page out of our own book. In 1942, shortly after the Battle of Midway, Admiral Towers was appointed Com-Air Pac and supervised the employment of our carriers for the balance of World War II. The 1933 fleet problem was designed to simulate a war in the Pacific, one initiated by carrier operations. Anticipating that Japan would attack before formally declaring war, as she had done against Russia in 1904, the scenario envisioned the sortie of the Japanese fleet eastward across the Pacific. This fleet, sinisterly designated Black, had ominous orders to inflict maximum damage on the Pearl Harbor Naval Base in order to destroy or reduce its effectiveness. The Army, a defending Blue Force, had put their forces on full alert January 27th, and 24-hour air patrols were initiated out to 150 miles. Avoiding these blue air patrols, the Black carriers and their escorts arrived at a position north of Molokai around midnight on January 30th. The strike force arrived over Pearl Harbor around dawn and was ruled to have inflicted serious damage. In 1935, Fleet Problem 16 was the largest mock battle ever staged, conducted over an area of the sea covering 5 million square miles of the North Central Pacific between Hawaii, Midway, and the Aleutian Islands, and involving 321 vessels, 70,000 men. Although 4 aircraft carriers participated, the major contribution to aviation was the experimentation with underway refueling that enabled carrier task forces to operate independently. Debate over the role of aircraft carriers continued and reached its nadir in 1938 when Admiral Claude C. Block was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Navy. It came as a shock to the Naval Aviation contingent, for Admiral Block regarded carriers as just another ship to serve as an auxiliary tied to the battle line. However, in 1938, the Black Fleet again simulated an attack on Hawaii. Saratoga was again commanded by Captain John Towers, who had earned his wings in 1911 as Naval Aviator No. 3. He was the first of the Navy's pioneer airmen to command a fleet carrier. Admiral Ernest King decided to effect a surprise air raid on Pearl Harbor. He directed Saratoga to the northwest of Hawaii, using a convenient weather front. At 0450 on March 29th, King launched an attack from 100 miles that hit the Army's Hickam and Wheeler airfields and Pearl Harbor Naval Air Station with devastating effect. As war loomed in Europe in 1939, Fleet Problem 20 was witnessed at sea by President Roosevelt while he was embarked on the cruiser Houston and the battleship Pennsylvania. From the time he had served as Secretary of the Navy, from 1913 to 1920, FDR took a lively interest in all matters pertaining to the Navy. Although short, Fleet Problem 20 demonstrated a high degree of sophistication in the development of American naval forces. The Navy's use of air power had clearly matured. Both commanders, Kalfuss and Andrews, had managed their air forces rather well, each concentrating his efforts on destroying his enemy's air power before going after his battle fleet. Each had made carriers the centerpiece of an independent task force. In December 1940, Fleet Problem 22 was canceled, as the Navy concentrated all effort on preparing for the eventuality of entering a shooting war. As a nation, we need to appreciate the dedication of our professional Annapolis-trained Corps of officers who endured the hardships of the 30s and worked intently on these fleet problems to keep our Navy in fighting shape. It can only be compared to athletes training for a future Olympics, constantly working out to stay in shape with exercises that were challenging both mentally and physically. The fleet problems had also trained pilots like Lieutenant Commanders Wade McCluskey, Max Leslie, and John Waldron of Battle of Midway fame as they searched the Pacific for the Japanese carriers on June 4, 1942. Having served as the cutting edge during the fleet exercises, they were well aware of the importance of disabling the flight decks of the Japanese carriers before they could launch a strike against our own carriers. Our carriers and the lives of their shipmates depended on it. It was this awareness that prompted John Waldron to lead his squadron in a chaotic foray into the Valley of Death. It was this awareness that drove Wade McCluskey to search beyond the point of no return to launch his attack on the Japanese carriers. We can safely say that the fleet problems made it possible for Admirals King and Nimitz to conceive and execute the plan to ambush the Japanese carriers at the Battle of Midway. The importance of being the first to strike in a carrier battle was frequently demonstrated by the problems. The years of perfecting carrier task force tactics and dive bombing techniques paid off at Midway. It is to be hoped that the budget crisis shaping up now in Washington does not hamper our nation's ability to support our Navy's continuing preparedness for threats unknown. We still need to support our professional Annapolis-trained officer corps, even when there is no apparent threat in view. Russia was kept at bay in the 1950s by the defensive strength of our own armed forces. Let's not repeat the 1930s mistake of weakening our military deterrent for political or economic reasons. Thank you for listening.